This is Dateline News and Conversation. My guest tonight, a very dear friend, someone who's had an amazing influence on me over the past few years. Some of you may know him. He's very well known, not only in the United States, but around the world because of his activism for peace, anti war, anti imperialism. He's an attorney, he's an author, and he's somebody put his life on the line and lost his legs on the tracks trying to stop a munitions train from delivering weapons to the Contras in Nicaragua. My guest tonight, my dear friend, S. Brian Willson from Nicaragua. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Regis.
Brian, it's so good to see you. You were born on the 4th of July.
That's what my birth certificate says.
Yep. And you've made what, 82 trips now around the sun?
I'm in my 83rd.
All right. So let's begin with this. In the introduction, I mentioned a little bit about your background. You started speaking out when you were in Vietnam. You haven't stopped. You've made many trips, peace trips, in various parts of the world, but to Central America and to Nicaragua, where you are a decorated now person with citizenship. You got run over by a train trying to stop the delivery of weapons to the Contras.
Of course, I expected the train to stop and be arrested. Never occurred to me that they would run the train.
Yeah. And so you would lose both legs, part of your skull.
Yeah.
Now, Brian, you're now living in Nicaragua for some time.
6 years.
6 years. Now, I want to ask you some questions about Nicaragua and about American influence in Nicaragua and Central America. Do the people there, do the governments there still feel the soft and hard power of the United States that you have fought so desperately and diligently against?
Well, of course, Nicaragua government, the Sandinista government, completely understands the vicious power of the U.S. mentality. Probably more articulated by Nicaragua because of the revolution in 1979. But I think gradually now, almost everybody in Latin America knows that the U.S. hegemony is not a positive thing for them. They lose their autonomy, and I think this is what's going on in Niger and Ukraine and the majority world is beginning to alert many more people that this has been a mythological journey that the U.S. has been on, and it's a hard one to crack because people's identity is wrapped up in it. In Latin America, their identities are wrapped up in U.S. imperialism, but in Nicaragua, they all know U.S. is an imperialist, and it's talked about all the time. And of course, the U.S. has sanctions on Nicaragua, and the sanctions do interfere with Nicaraguan sovereignty. But we'll see what happens with the BRICS and the BRICS expansion that's in the works, and when there might be an alternative currency. There will be an alternative currency in the world, and it may be several of them. But in Nicaragua, every year, President Ortega talks about you can't trust the U.S. 1 minute, and their imperialism is really vicious, and that the people of the United States it's hard for them to recognize it because they live comfortably, or they thought they lived comfortably. They've been protected by two oceans for all these centuries, and countries to the north and the south that haven't posed real threats to them. In fact, they stole half of Mexico, and they didn't succeed in conquering Canada in the War of 1812. So the people in the U.S. haven't had immediate threats. Their immediate threats come from within, from the destabilization and the dysfunctionality of the capitalist system.
I want to pursue a little bit further. Is the United States still militarily involved in Central America? I think people need to know this, Brian.
Well, they've got troops especially in Colombia. They have a large presence, and I'm not sure now whether they have troops in Honduras or Guatemala, other than embassy personnel. They still have some troops in Panama. They still have a base there.
But is there fighting?
No.
Are there death squads that are continuing because they were there in the past?
Yeah, the death squads now in Honduras and El Salvador are simply composed of gangs that are offspring of parents who left Central America in the 80s and 90s to flee the U.S. wars that were being financed against them. And they grew up in the U.S., and many of them were deported to their home countries, El Salvador and Honduras, and they have formed really vicious gangs. They're also involved with the drug cartels, and they control the neighborhoods. But it's not U.S. military, but it's a product of U.S. military. It's a product of U.S. policy that destabilized these countries and made them so violent that people were seeking refuge in the 80s and 90s, and they went to Los Angeles, and they had a hard time adjusting to the U.S. Well, they created their own society in Los Angeles in the name of gangs. And so, wherever you go, the U.S. is fucking it up.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. So is life rather peaceful and calm and harmonious where you are in Nicaragua under President Daniel Ortega,
yes,
who's been there a long time?
It's very peaceful, very functional, very progressive. Life is pretty normal. Over 90% food sufficiency here in Nicaragua.
Whoa.
70% renewable energy from these geothermal plants in the volcanoes, and fantastic road system, fantastic new bridges everywhere, gender equity. I think they're one of the leaders in the world in gender equity, meaning women in government and in leading positions, more than men, really. And of course, they have a great healthcare system and education system. And so the government pays the infrastructure. of these major projects, indispensable projects such as healthcare and education and food sufficiency, because they give a lot of subsidies to farmers for becoming self-sufficient. And
Well, now, Brian,
seeds and fertilizer.
yeah, you now have citizenship, correct?
Correct.
And what people need to know, if they're not familiar with you, and some of them may not be.
Oh, no, there's a lot that aren't.
But you were highly decorated by President Daniel Ortega several years ago, and you have been. I mean, I think you're like a legend. You're an icon in Nicaragua. Can you go out on the street anymore?
Yeah, I can. Still, people want to take pictures, and but I'm getting older now, so it's not as easy to recognize me as it used to be. Yeah, I can go out on the street. The younger people don't know me so much, but the older people all do, because of the Contra War.
Yeah, and what was the medal, the decoration that Ortega gave you several years ago?
Well, I now have 3 decorations from Nicaragua. The first one was the Augustus Cesar Sandino Medal, and to tell you the truth, I don't know the full names of the other 2 medals that have been awarded me by the National Assembly. One of which required me to give a speech to the National Assembly. That was about 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah, I mean, they call me a hero. Ortega and the government calls me a hero, and they love me, and they make that clear all the time, how much they love me. And of course, that's a nice feeling, but I'm not doing much, to tell you the truth. Because of my walking, that's a big discouragement from me doing a lot of things, because it's so much effort to walk now. Apparently, when I had my back surgery in 2018 of the lumbar region, it was rebuilt completely with titanium bars, screws, and rods. What I didn't know was that those rods and bars essentially over time replaced muscular structure around the lower lumbar. So I don't have a lot of muscular structure around the lumbar region. It's been replaced by titanium. I don't understand that completely. I mean, my lumbar, I had what they call lumbar stenosis. It's pretty serious when you get what they call a stenosis. I had the operation, which was very successful in eliminating all pain in my back. I haven't had any since. But the price now is that I have to walk with a walker. Yeah. And I've been walking with a cane. Now it's with a walker, because it's gotten to the point where I will fall a lot, even with just a cane.
And I want to point out that since you were run over by that train, you have been walking on 2 prosthesis, artificial legs.
Right.
Are you still bicycling? Because you've bicycled thousands of miles with your, I don't know what you call that bicycle, but
arm-powered hand cycle.
Arm-powered, yeah. Are you still bicycling?
No, I'm not. I've completed 100,000 miles since 1997, I think. So over a 20-year period, I did 100,000 miles. But I haven't done much since I came to Nicaragua.
Yeah, well,
I have my hand cycle here. I just haven't used it much.
Yeah. it's been an amazing career. Um, it goes all the way back to really when your childhood in upstate New York, uh, patriotic American,
I was a
conservative.
poster boy.
Yeah, yeah, poster boy. And then you went to Vietnam, and then all hell broke loose,
Right.
and you've been causing hell all over the place. Now, Brian, if I recall correctly, you've also been to North Korea.
Yeah, twice. And
How
South
did you?
Korea 8 times.
Yeah, how did you manage getting into North Korea?
Well, I was working with a bunch of South Koreans who were working on normalization between North and South. But these Koreans were born in the South after 1950. And so I got involved with them in the 1990s. And they have good relations with the North Korean government. So it was because of my connection to them, Koreans who were working on reunification, actually, that the North Korean government felt safe with me being in the country. In other words, I wasn't going to be a saboteur.
Yeah. Well, I found that all quite amazing, and um, I want to ask you now about some contemporary things because
Plenty of them.
yeah, but there's a couple of big ones. Uh, from for most of your life, you have been writing. I mean, you've written volumes. Your book, Blood on the Tracks, is known by millions and millions of people. You
I
have
don't.
been
I doubt that.
now. I'm sure it's it's hundreds, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people know who you are, and you have been an outspoken critic of United States foreign policy for all of your adult life.
Well, all of my post-Vietnam life.
Yeah, yeah, correct. But that's most of your adult life.
Yeah,
Yeah. Um, I want to ask you now because this is something that you have opened my eyes and influenced me tremendously. You have talked about the myth of American exceptionalism, or the great lie that began with Christopher Columbus in 1492. I want you to share with me now, because I know your thoughts on this. How has this lie, I call it a lie.
yeah, it's a
I
lie.
don't think it's a myth.
It's a grand lie.
How has it shaped the American consciousness in all of these hundreds of years? How has that happened, Brian?
Well, it's happened because we've had 20 generations of people um, since the 1600s that pass on the same memes and the same ideas about the city on a hill and how the indigenous are merciless savages and how the blacks, of course, are not even humans. So, of course, the Indians weren't humans either in our minds. Um, I mean, it's very deep. I believed in all of it. I was so proud to be born and raised in the United States and born on July 4th. Um, I was a Boy Scout. I was active in my church. Um, in 1961 or two, I applied to the FBI to be a junior special agent. And I studied Russian at George Washington University on the belief, if you can believe it, that there were a lot of communist cells in the United States all over the country speaking Russian. And I thought if I knew Russian, I could infiltrate these cells. Now, fortunately for me, J. Edgar Hoover sent me a form letter in 1962 rejecting my application. I had already met with 3 FBI agent offices in Rochester, New York, Buffalo, New York, Jamestown, New York, and had filled out a 50-page questionnaire. And I thought I was a perfect candidate because I was so patriotic. I loved the United States. But I was actually depressed when I was turned down. So I decided to go into the seminary, and I went to a Baptist college. I transferred to a Baptist college, and there in 1963, 62, 63, 64, I started my questioning of religion. But I hadn't started questioning the political system of the U.S. yet, but I was definitely questioning religion. So much so that other people in my dorm at the college, at Eastern Baptist College, which is now called Eastern University, they had a prayer group in the dormitory for backsliders. And they would identify students that were backsliding. And so they invited me to the group. And the very first time I went in to the meeting, to one of their meetings, which was in a dorm room, there was about maybe 10 or 15 guys that all welcomed me and put their hands on my shoulder and asked me how I was with Jesus. And I at that point, I left the room. And for some reason, that didn't gel with me. And so that began my revolt against organized religion and Christianity. But I still believed in communism and the need for J. Edgar Hoover and Joseph McCarthy and so forth. So, it's a hard road. It's a hard road to break because it's so comfortable. It's so comforting to think that you're part of the best country in the history of the world, endowed by our Creator to bring prosperity to the impoverished and Christianity to the heathen. I mean, it's an incredible fairy tale. But I bought it, and I was from a small town where most people in the 50s were all intensely anti-communist. And it was, it's parochial growing up in rural America, in the sense that you don't know too much about what's going on except the lie. I didn't know poets or beatniks or people that were in my community that stood out as critics of the system. I didn't know anybody. It was everybody was happy to be an American, a U.S. American, even if their life was kind of miserable. Because in my small town, there was a lot of alcoholism. I think there is in almost every small town. Now it's drugs. But at any rate, I was a poster boy until 1969 when I was in Vietnam. And I happened by chance to be visiting a village after it had been bombed by a combination of South Vietnamese and U.S. pilots with napalm, and everybody in the village was dead, including hundreds of children, at least 100, I'd say. And I was wondering, now, is this a mistake or is this intentional? And so I realized soon from my inquiry that it was intentional, that we wanted body counts. That's the most important thing. Body counts. Doesn't matter if they're 1 month old, 1 year old, 10 years old. We needed bodies. And that just about drove me crazy. literally.
All right. Well, I know that story. I've heard you tell it. I've read about it. Um, but what it took for you to wake up was that kind of jolting, horrific experience that made you start to question. Now, I have been talking about this recently and over a number of years with a lot of people. How is it that Americans who have been so immersed in the lie, one lie built upon another lie?
Well, they all have to perpetuate the original lie. You have to keep
So,
it going.
yeah, exactly. And so I've been talking about how it is that people and many friends of mine, even my own family, cannot accept the truth about their country, their country's history, and their country's actions today, because as you have been saying, they're so comfortable. They're so comfortable in the belief that their country is about goodness, spreading freedom and democracy around
But
the
they
world.
make mistakes, but they're just mistakes.
Yeah, and yeah, what I'm beginning to understand um, is that for Americans to break out of this paralysis, and I think it's a psychological disease. I really
It is.
do.
It is. It's like a
Uh,
hypnosis.
yeah, it takes some kind of a traumatic experience that Americans have not yet experienced. Would you agree?
Yes, I agree. It requires something that jolts your soul, something that jolts your uh, assumptions about your country. That is fed to you. The narrative is fed over and over. Just today, look at how we demonize Russia. We've been doing that since 1917, really, um, and now since 2016, the Democrats used it as an excuse, RussiaGate, as to why Hillary Clinton lost the election. And now it is just this anti-Russian sentiment is incredible. It's not rational. It's like my father used to say. He was a deacon in the Baptist church. When I became political, I would say to my father, I said, "You think that you're Jesus, who he talked about a lot. Your Jesus would support killing small children in other countries just because they're in those countries, and we think that those countries have a bad policy and that that everybody there is dispensable." And he said, simple answer: they're communists. If they're communists, you kill them. So that's the level of intellectual, uh, questioning or analysis that exists in the United States, because it is a very comfortable. Even if your life isn't comfortable materially, you have the notion that you still live in the greatest country in the history of the world. Uh, so I mean, it's really hard to break it because it is so comfortable, and one's identity, such as mine, was wrapped up in that narrative. And it was in Vietnam that my identity was cracked. And it was in Nicaragua that it was completely blown open in 1986 when I witnessed the aftermath of three counterattacks near where I was living in the mountains of Esteli. And I saw, let's see, the Contras had killed 11 people in those attacks, and I saw 5 or 6 coming into the cemetery on horse-drawn wagons and open caskets. And that was at that point that another thing clicked with me, which was, my God, this is what the U.S. has always been doing since 1607 or since 1492. It destroys anything that they see is in their way, and anything that's different looking or different thinking or different acting is in their way because they're so insecure. So it was in that moment in January of '86 that I said, Jesus, this is exactly what the U.S. does all the time.
Yeah,
Everywhere.
yeah, and you can see it today. You can
Yeah.
see it everywhere you look. I mean, you look at the former Yugoslavia, Kosovo, Serbia. You look at what the United States is doing in the former Soviet republics,
Yeah.
Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Abkhazia. They are stirring up trouble everywhere. And today, Brian, we're going to shift gears and talk about this now. The United States has been deploying this same strategy in Ukraine against Russia. You mentioned Russia phobia, and you mentioned it's been since at least, I think you said 1917,
Since the Russian Revolution.
since the Russian Revolution, that the United States has been bent on destroying Russia.
Exactly.
Now, Brian, your thoughts on this current conflict in Ukraine? I'm living now in Russia, in Crimea, the beautiful city of Yalta, right next door to this war. The United States has stated very clearly its foreign policy is all about taking down Russia and stealing its resources, just as they've done since Christopher Columbus came, committed genocide, brought slaves to America, and stole not only land and resources, but labor.
Right.
Brian, people are saying that Putin, unprovoked, attacked this poor country seeking to be democratic in part of Europe. Do you think for 1 minute that the United States narrative in this entire conflict is accurate?
No, it's absolutely inaccurate. It's underestimated the strength of Russia and the nationalism of the Russian people, or at least the love of the Russian people for their country, and completely overestimates U.S. capacity to control people, because that's what they've been doing, certainly since World War II. So the United States has a hubris about themselves that is causes a delusion about who they are, and it underestimates other people who have a belief that they should be free of the molestation of the U.S., which has become a habit since 1945. So everything we hear about Ukraine is a lie. I mean, the fact that it was unprovoked, what a lot of bullshit. You can go back to 1990, 91 with the fall of the Soviet Union, which was the time that NATO should have been disbanded, because NATO's job was to protect Europe from the Soviet Union, the communists. No, the NATO didn't disband. It's been expanding. And they've been told by politicians, by political scientists in the US, as well as the Russians, that it's a red line. But the United States is insistent on following their MO, exploitation, dehumanization, and becoming successful at it. And now we have a world, a majority world, that knows the U.S. is not up to any good.
Okay.
And Ukraine highlights that with the fact that we're willing to sacrifice every Ukrainian in our ideological war against Russia. It has nothing to do with Ukraine. I mean, it's amazing that we are willing to sacrifice everybody, but we've always done that. That's how we were founded. We sacrificed the native population in the Americas. We sacrificed them. They were merciless savages, Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence. They're in the way of our land, our land, our land. And then England was going to illegalize slavery, and we had to get rid of the king. Another reason we had to get rid of the king is we needed those slaves to be prosperous. And we're used to living with impunity. We live with impunity. And that's a very dangerous way to be because you're a narcissist, basically. You believe that you're better than others and that whatever you want, you can get and don't have to pay anything for it. So it's everything about Ukraine is a lie. It's totally provoked. The United States worked very hard to get Russia angry enough to intervene in Ukraine, eastern Ukraine. I don't think they wanted to particularly, but the Russian-speaking people in the eastern Ukraine were desperate for help after 8 years of being bombarded by the Ukrainians and the Nazi elements of the Ukrainian military. And the U.S. knew that was going to happen, and they wanted it to happen. They wanted the Russians to intervene and call it an unprovoked, but it's been provoked since 2014. Since the
All right, Brian, you mentioned the word dangerous. Where I'm sitting and looking at what the United States has unilaterally done is withdraw from every nuclear arms treaty that was signed between the United States and Russia. Unilaterally pulled out, quit, withdrew. So where we are today is Russia realizing that this is not really a proxy war, but a war, a continuous war of the United States against the Russian Federation to bring about regime change, get rid of that evil bastard Putin, and destroy the Russian Federation. But the danger is the nuclear policy of the United States, that it maintains a first strike policy. And Russia has modified its nuclear stance, its nuclear policy, to say that it will never strike first, but it will strike if its existence is threatened. Brian, I don't know about you, but that scares the bejesus out of me.
Very scary.
I'd like to know your thoughts, because a lot of people here don't believe there will ever be a nuclear confrontation. I disagree, but I want to know what your thoughts are on the danger of this conflict between two massively nuclear-powered nations with some 9,000 combined nuclear weapons aimed at each other.
Well, I'm more concerned about the psyche and the ideological identity of the United States being so threatened by Ukraine and by Russia, that they're not going to negotiate, they say, because their intention is to destroy Russia. But if it's unsuccessful, which it seems like it will be, how do they save their hubris? Are they going to put troops on the ground? Are they going to come to their senses and say, well, maybe we'll make a compromise? But my fear is that it's like a cornered animal. A cornered animal will do things it normally wouldn't do because it doesn't think it has an option except to lash out. And I don't think the United States is going to ever tolerate troops on the ground in Europe again, or at least not very many. And that leaves nuclear option for a country that's insane. The United States it kind of has this very significant mental illness that is better than everybody else, and it has impunity. And I think after 20 generations of this being transmitted to the present day, that's a hard hubris to break, especially when your idea of hegemony and world control is now severely threatened, which it hasn't been for really ever before. So it wasn't even threatened in World War II, really. Most of the business in the United States supported Hitler, and they supported his buildup. The idea was that Hitler was better than Russia for a lot of people in the U.S. Hitler was opposed to communism in Russia, and we would rather go with Germans rather than Russians. It just so happened history that we became an ally of Russia against Germany for those 4 years in the 1940s. And then as soon as the war was over, we had a plan to nuclear bomb over 200 Russian cities in 1945. I mean, we're crazy. We're insane. And it scares me, but all I can do is enjoy Nicaragua in the meantime before I die. I mean, if there's a nuclear war, we're all gonna be impacted severely, wherever you are.
All right. So on the one hand, we have this realistic, existential, even immediate threat of thermonuclear annihilation,
right,
an Armageddon, because of what the United States is doing to provoke Russia. But they're also doing this to China.
Yeah.
Now, I don't want to focus on China because I want to focus on what you and I talked about before we even started the program. These seismic shifts that are taking place in the world today on a higher geopolitical view, a macro view of what's happening. Brian, today, the BRICS nation plus convened in South Africa. President Putin has been saying for a couple of years now, repeatedly, as well as their foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, that we are now living in the beginning of a multipolar world, and that it is the end. It spells the end of United States hegemony, domination of the planet. I would like your thoughts on this because I have been focusing on this for the last couple of years, that it seems to be picking up speed precisely because of the conflict in Ukraine.
Right.
I would like to know your thoughts on this, Brian, where you see it's going. Is it the birth of a new world order? And, Brian, can we survive in the meantime to welcome that new world order?
Well, that's a good question, of course. And the biggest threat to that new world order is the United States, because the U.S. will see itself as a loser in a in a multipolar world. And as I said, they're crazy. I mean, people like Victoria Nuland and Jake Sullivan and Burns and Blinken, they're just so far out of it. But they are Biden's advisors, and Biden is out of it. So we're dealing with people who are not diplomats. They don't know how to do diplomacy because they have impunity, historic impunity. They get their way one way or the other. They don't have to negotiate. So the danger is that the U.S. is going to use nuclear weapons to get itself out of this jam. But the truth is that the majority world supports Russia in Ukraine. And I think just like in Niger, these people finally saying, look, France, you've been robbing us blind for so long, and we're sick of it. We don't want to be exploited anymore, which is basically true for all of Europe and the U.S. is built on exploitation since 1492. And I think the Niger people and the people that orchestrated the coup, they know, like with people in Burkina Faso or Mali or even Algeria, the idea starts catching on that, my God, we have been giving up our autonomy to the U.S. and Europe for all these centuries at our expense. And so it's contagious. Sovereignty is contagious. Self-determination is contagious. And for these nations that haven't really had self-determination, and they've had U.S.-style democracies, which is a joke, just in name only, they would like to think that they can continue their democratic style, which is really tyrannical. But they're not going to be able to do it because people like you and I, we come to our senses at some point and we say, well, I don't, that's not what I was born to do in the world, to be somebody's slave or to be at the mercy of somebody else. But the question is whether the U.S. and Europe will allow that. And I mean, the only way they can prevent it is to destroy the planet.
All right, Brian, another question. Neither one of us is living in the United States.
Thank God.
From where you and I sit, and from what we've just been talking about, it looks to me like the United States dominance of the world, its hegemony, is quickly coming to an end.
I agree.
Yeah, what we're seeing, 85% of the world does not want to follow this model anymore. They want what you talked about is sovereignty, respect, self-determination. They're focused on freedom, development, where everybody prospers. But when we look at what's happening when I do anyway, what's happening across Europe because of the war and the sanctions that America has placed on Russia, blowing up the pipeline, which has destroyed the German economy and the rest of Europe. What is happening in the United States, Brian? I wonder if you agree with this. What we're seeing is a political situation that has never been seen before in the United States, completely corrupt. We're seeing a carnival, a circus, a very tragic political scene that's being played out daily in front of the American people. They know they're not being represented. We are seeing that the United States has lost its moral conscience, if it ever had one,
If it ever had one.
its spirituality, its sense of togetherness, community. We are seeing division everywhere over every possible issue, from immigration to sexuality to religion to Democrat to Republican to Russia. Doesn't matter.
It's a complete failed state at this point. And it's just self destruction. I mean, you look at downtown San Francisco now and downtown Portland, Oregon. There's hardly any stores open.
Yeah,
The
and
crime,
tens of
the homelessness,
yeah,
the crime, the lack of any vision by our leaders for something different than capitalism. It's enemy. You know the word enemy, ANOMIE. It's like all the forms that we grew up believing in are gone. The norms, it's formlessness, like. And I've been watching on YouTube for the last year interviews with a lot of the homeless people in Philadelphia. I mean, it's a series of documentaries by a couple of guys that are interviewing people in Phoenix, Los Angeles, Tucson, Philadelphia, a few other places, San Francisco. And what's interesting is that some of these people, and they're all addicted, and there's thousands of them, and it's expanding all the time. Now the number of overdoses in the U.S. is skyrocketing. I mean, skyrocketing. And why do people take drugs? Well, to relieve themselves of anxiety or hopelessness or feelings that aren't comfortable. And yet, a lot of these people came from what are called good homes, middle class and upper middle class homes. I mean, they're all asked in the interviews what kind of a home they grew up in. And some of them had both parents addicted, but not all of them. So it doesn't matter if you have good parents right now in the United States, because the society is so sick throughout the society. You have to be very extraordinarily conscious to raise children without the drugs getting them or without the ideology tricking them. I mean, it's true. It's a soulless country. Does not have a soul. Its moral compass is, if we ever had one, it's dissolved completely. So I get from these interviews that this is such a pervasive issue that has to do with the fact that you're living in a country that is very dysfunctional, and you feel it inside yourself. You feel anxiety, you feel despair, and you go to use drugs for relief. It's a relief. And then when you get hooked on fentanyl, there's almost no way of getting off of it. I watch these interviews every day. It's incredible. It's an incredible sociological experience for me. I was never a druggie, but I grew up in an era where most of the drugs were alcohol. We didn't have so much cocaine and heroin. All these people are heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, crystal meth addicts, and some of them are so articulate. They want out. They can't get free of the drug or the withdrawal pain. When you start to withdraw, the pain is so intense, you want another pill, you want another hit, you want to get high. So that is just another example or expression of how dysfunctional the culture is. It's it doesn't have anything. It doesn't have any compass. There's no glue holding it together. Imperialism is the only thing that has held it together since World War II, but we've all believed in it. We all consented to it. Until the 60s, at least. So we don't have a deep thinking population because we haven't had to. We haven't had neighbors that were threatening us. And we've had the city on the hill mentality since 1630. 20 generations. So it's a serious problem. And as you said earlier, until people have some kind of a traumatic or real painful experience, it's really hard for them to break their addiction to the comfort of the American way of life, which is no longer even true.
Yeah. You said something, a soulless nation. It reminded me that's exactly one of the things that Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union.
Right.
Soulless, evil empire. It's amazing that in these 50 or so years, it's the country of our birth, which we grew up loving and supporting. Now we see it without a soul. You've described it so well. Nothing to tie it together again. Not religion, not patriotism. It's a ship without a rudder.
It's a shithole.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, Brian, and we'll end on this note. As I look at history, and I'm wondering if maybe the best way out of this, before we're all nuked, is for the United States to experience a colossal collapse like the Soviet Union experienced.
I agree.
In the 1990s.
Well, it's in a state of collapse now. It still hasn't hit bottom, but it's on its way down. It's really, I'm also watching a series of documentaries about towns all over the United States, in all 50 states. And it's pretty depressing. I mean, there's these gated communities, but if you want to consider those as a model community, those are just where the rich live and protect themselves, and they think they're going to live forever that way. But it is really in a state of collapse, and it projects all the time. It uses the concept of projection, like with Russia. They project on others our own shadow that we don't want to deal with, and that's the way It's a way of being in denial. We project on Russia. We project on. We've always used projection, always demonizing somebody else rather than looking at ourselves. And what I had to do in Vietnam was I had to finally look at myself. I was 27, though. I wasn't 23, 21. And I realized that I was an ideological robot. I was just going along with the orders, with the notion that the communists were bad, they had to be stopped, and then I realized, no, it's us. We're the merciless savages. And I said that to our commander when I was leaving the country in August of 1969. I was sent home early, and I said to our colonel boss, who we hated each other, and we had during the whole assignment. I said, well, Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence about the merciless Indian savages. I said, now, you know, and I know who the savages are, and you and I are among them.